Hello and welcome to Maya 101, week number 5. This is going to be our special effects class. Now, what we're going to be doing in this class is kind of interesting. I'm not going to turn it into a big, long, involved discussion of particles. We're going to be focusing on creating a single effect. And by effect, I don't just mean particles. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff involved. And this effect is going to be a sparkler. You know, like the kind you get for, a fireworks stand. Hopefully, you live in a country where you can have fireworks. I'm surprised some people don't, but it happens. But anyway, it's just a little tiny gray stick, and you light it on fire, and little sparks fly out of it, and it's very pretty and fun to watch. So that's what we're going to be creating. Now, this sparkler is not just particles, but of course particles are part of it. If you've never seen one of these before, they look vaguely like this. So they're a stick, and the stick gets, just noticeably wider at the top because it's dipped in, like, gunpowder, more or less. And you light the tip of it, and once it's lit, it just fires all these sparks off in random directions and is very pretty. Now, while it's burning, of course, the upper end of it, very much like a cigarette, gets all black and charred, and everything down here stays a nice color. Now, what we're going to create is the following. We're going to create the stick geometry. We're going to create a special shader, or let's say material. Let me try to be consistent with my terminology. Special material for the stick that allows for burning. Meaning that our material will transition from light gray to dark gray, kind of burnt, based on us moving a locator, which is going to be really, really nifty. And then we need our particle system. Now, along the way, I've got to show you all kinds of new things. We've got to talk about set-driven keys and how that works and how we can set them up. We are actually going to do a very little bit of Mel. One single line, but it is very cool. So we're basically going to create a set-driven key scenario using Mel instead of using the interface, which will be very, very cool. What else are we going to take a look at? Ramps, which are gradients, if you're unfamiliar with the term. And we're going to be taking a look, of course, at particles. Now, this effect that I'm showing you guys how to put together tonight, this sparkler effect, in the great big grand scheme of things, I wouldn't call it a super complex effect by any means. However, for an entry-level class, I am pushing things a little bit, which is why I want to just warn you guys in advance that I'm going to be pushing forward at a pretty good clip just to make sure I have plenty of time to do everything. Now, if things backfire and we get done early, then I will just hang out and make sure there are no further questions and then just kind of go from there. And if there are no more questions, we might end early tonight. If not, then, that's just how it goes. So let's jump into our scenes like so. So here's my scene, and, we've got, at this point, a little animated cherry doing its thing. And it's great. But we need our sparkler geometry. And before we can even start on this, I have to bring up a brand new topic. I want to start organizing my scene into layers. In your channel box / layer editor, if you look down here at the bottom, we have the layer editor, which is divided into display, render, and anim. We don't need animation layers. We're not going to worry about render layers in this class. There are pros and cons for using them. For simplicity's sake, we're going to avoid them for the time being. We're going to break our scene up into render layers, however, so that we can hide things we don't need to see. So what I want you to do first is if you take a look down here in your display layer, your display layer window, so make sure the display tab is active. Take a look at these buttons. You see there's an up arrow, a down arrow, create a new layer, and then create a new layer and assign selected objects. What I want you to do is select your plate, select your cake, select your whipped cream. If your whipped cream is 2 pieces like mine, select both pieces, and then click on the last button, which is create a new layer and assign selected objects. Immediately this comes in as being named layer 1. We want to change the name of this, so let's right-click, and let's see, add. We don't want to add, we don't want to remove, we don't want to select all the objects. let's just double click on the name. And if you double click on the name, you'll get this window that popped up off the monitor, so I had to drag it over here. Let's change the name to LYR. I like using that prefix for a layer. So just LYR underscore cake, which is funny because that sounds like layer cake. The reason I put layer or LYR at the beginning is that if I have anything else named cake, Maya will scream at me, and I know that. Now that I have this layer in place, you'll see I have this little V, that's for visibility. I can turn that on and off now at any given point, which is very nice. Now we have a couple of other features as well. We can set this to template, which means it'll only show as a wireframe in our view, and it will not render. We can set it to a reference, which will render, but is unselectable. I cannot select this right now. But we'll just go ahead and leave it at normal just for a moment. Go ahead and select your table and do the same thing. So you're going to click on the Create a New Layer and Assign Selected Objects. Go ahead and double click this, and we'll name this Layer Table. And click Save. And then grab both of the pieces of your cherry. Same thing. Layer cherry. Now you might have noticed that I have just hidden most of my cherry's rig with show flags. So if you wanted to, you could actually show things like locators. And I'm not saying do this, I'm just saying you can if you so desire. You can show all of your locators and just put those into a layer, call it something like layer cherry rig, and then you can turn your rig on and off. So, I prefer to work that way when I have a very complicated rig. But in this case, since all we've got is really just a couple of locators to animate, it's easier not to have to do that. So, now everything is nicely broken up. What I want you to do is just turn off your cake. And it looks like I've still got a residual NURBS curve floating around here. Let's just grab that and hit delete. We don't need that anymore. And that should make my scene nice and clean. You can also take your cherry and turn that off as well. And I'll go ahead and just go back to show and turn off NURBS curves, so that goes away. So now all I have here is just my table. Now I'm going to do a really quick ready check for people to get up to this point. If you are following along with me as I click, please make sure and activate your participate status. It is what I use to make sure you're following along. And let's just see who is done up to this point. Okay, so you've just got your table here. Let's go ahead and create our sparkler. Now the sparkler is a very thin piece of geometry. We don't need a lot of actual detail in order for it to do its job, so we're going to keep this very minimal. Let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and make a cylinder. Now it just says, of course, to drag this out on the grid. I don't really care where you drag it, and I don't really care how big you make it. Just get a cylinder in place. Take your X and your Z translates and set them both to 0. That will move your sparkler to the middle of the scene. Then we're going to focus on the input node, because the input node changes everything about your cylinder. Take your subdivisions around the axis. By default, this should be set to 20. Set this to 6. So it's really just a big hexagonal cylinder. Your radius needs to be tiny, and you may not know exactly how tiny it needs to be. You might have built your scene to a slightly different scale than mine. So if you want to temporarily turn your cake back on to give you an idea of how tiny you can make it, you know, by all means do that. But what I want is something that would be approximately toothpick size. So 0.094 even looks a little bit thick. So let's cut that in half, or about half, to 0.05, and that looks about right. Now, my height in this case, this looks pretty good for a height, I think. We don't really need it to be much bigger, and we can always change the height using our vertices if we really, really want to. So I'll go ahead and hide my cake at this point. I do need to take the upper area and kind of thicken it up as I had in my drawing. And if you've seen one of these sparklers, of course, it all becomes a lot easier. Because they're kind of dipped in this little explosive powder stuff, they get a little thicker at the top, like a very, very skinny corn dog or something. So that's a great way to look at it. So here's how to model a very simple skinny corn dog. We're going to hold down Shift and right mouse and grab the Insert Edge Loop tool. And I'm just going to insert an edge loop, you know, maybe a third of the way up the body will do. So maybe right about here. And that's all I need. So I can just click Q, and you can see I have just one tiny little new edge right here. Now, I'm going to switch over to faces, so hold down the right mouse button, go to faces, and just grab all these faces at the top. Now it's a little hard to see my selection, so let me see if I go to wireframe. It should be a little easier. I'm just selecting the upper portion and not the lower portion. That's why I added that edge loop there to kind of cut off the selection. I'll frame up on this, and I'm going to zoom in really tight so you can see this. We're going to do an extrusion. So shift right mouse and choose extrude face, which we've done a few times now. Now, wherever your show manipulator tool turns up, and it'll be different depending on your selection. On some cases it'll be on the side of the stick, some of you it'll be up top like mine. It doesn't matter. You want to use the blue handle. Pull outward slightly with the blue handle, and that will just create a little bit of thickness. You don't need much. A little goes a long way. Let's go slightly more than this. Pink. And there you go. You see how it's just added a little bit of thickness. Now, at the end of the day, that's really all we need to make Sparkler. There's some vanity stuff we can do. For instance, we can take this outermost edge right here. So if I switch over to edges and just double click on that edge, I can move this up slightly, and it just creates the tiniest amount of rounding right there. We're going to be so far from it, that's more than what we need probably, but at least it keeps that from being a super sharp edge. And then we can take the top, grab this one little vertex right here at the center, and just move that up slightly. And if for some reason you have like a ring of edges up here, meaning you didn't grab the top cap when you were selecting, you could just pull the next ring of edges up as well to create a little rounding up top. But that's it. I mean, we've now created our model. When you are finished with this, you should have a very simple stick that gets wider at the top. We're almost done. I want you to select the whole thing. Hold down Shift and right mouse. Go to Soften, Harden Edges, and just choose Soften Edge. What that'll do is it'll make it look more cylindrical than it really is. One more time. That's Shift right mouse when you have the object selected, and go to Soften, Harden Edge, and just choose Soften Edge. Yep, it's polygonal Pocky. There you go. Perfect. The final thing is to go to Edit, Delete by Type, and nuke out your history so that this is just a piece of geometry. Actually, second to last final thing, because the final thing is go ahead and name this. Call this geo_sparkler. So we know it's the geometry for the sparkler. And I'll give everybody a quick ready check to get up to this part of it. Okay, so we have a really, really simple model for our sparkler. The next thing we need to do is produce a material for it. And this is where things get a little bit fun. We get to kind of review back over some materials. We get to make a very, very cool material. And then in a moment, I'm going to show you guys how to properly animate this material so that we can have this sparkler burn down, which will, of course, be very, very cool. So let's go to Window, Rendering Editors, and open up the Hypershade. You could probably argue that this material should be in some way shiny. Nevertheless, because it is so small and takes up, our sparkler that is so small and takes up so little screen space, what we're going to do instead is just use a very simple Lambert material to create this. So just middle mouse drag in a Lambert, and let's go ahead and rename this. We'll call this matte underscore sparkler body. Don't call it matte sparkler because we're going to need another material for our sparks later on. And get this applied to your object. Of course, a lot of ways to do that. You can middle mouse drag it right on top. You can select the geometry, hold down the right mouse button, and choose Assign Material to Selection. Of course, there's a bunch of other ways to do that as well. Whatever floats your boat. Now, I am just going to show my work area. And I'm going to try to buy myself as much screen space as I reasonably can, knowing that I'm a little bit limited. So we can see our sparkler kind of wedged onto the end there. I actually need to open up the attribute editor, so I can't really do it that way. So it's got to be something kind of like this. I can't really close that off either. I need too much stuff in it. Okay, so we'll start with our sparkler body. And what we're going to do for starters is just create some general lumpy bumpiness to it. As soon as we do this, we're going to see that we have to update, well, we may have to update the UVs for it, depending on how some of you did your modeling. In my case, I probably won't really have to, but let's see here. Let me just grab a noise, and we'll just middle mouse drag this into the scene. So I have a noise, like so. Now, I hate that these noises have an amplitude of 1. We ran into this before when we were trying to create a texture for our plate. It makes things go blotchy and get all the way out to white. So set your amplitude to 0.5. Again, that's your amplitude. You want to set that to 0.5. Now, what I'm looking for here is a light gray texture. It's going to go from a light gray to a slightly darker gray. If you go under the color balance attributes, you have these two sliders, color gain and color offset. These two sliders control what your noise looks like. So set your color gain to a nice pale gray and pull your color offset to a color just near it. And it's going to take a little bit of working back and forth to find just the combination that I like. So I'm actually kind of inching my way down the scale. That looks pretty good, I think. So I've only changed two things. I set my amplitude to 0.5, and I adjusted color gain and color offset so that color gain is like a pale gray. Color offset is just a slightly darker gray. And it's not even really all that pale. It only looks pale next to the interface. The interface is already kind of dark. Now, I'm going to connect this temporarily to color. So, as we've seen before, we middle mouse drag, we release, and choose color. By all means, tap the 6 key over here in your view and see what that looks like. I'll go ahead and do a quick ready check for people to get to this point. I just got a question from Ryan. He said, how do you hide the objects in your layers again? Well, if you take a look at your layer editor, you'll see this little tiny V icon. Any object that is in a layer can be shown or hidden just by clicking on that. So that they'll show up in one layer and be hidden in another. Ooh. Yeah, that's not the way it works. We're just putting each object in one layer. These are just like layers inside of Photoshop. You're just basically saying all of the pieces of the cake in this instance have been assigned to this layer, so that when I hide this layer, the cake goes with it. All of the pieces of the table, there's only one, have been assigned to this layer, so when I hide that, the table goes away. And the same thing with the cherry. Alright. So, very, very simple material right now. It's just a Lambert. It just has a noise. The only thing fancy about the noise is that we took the amplitude, pulled it down to 0.5, and then we took the color gain and color offset and just set those to two very near shades of gray. That's really all there is to it. Very, very simple. However, we are getting some really odd blotchiness all across the body of our sparkler, and we want this to look a lot smaller, like little tiny, noise all over the thing. So grab your Place 2D texture node, and we're going to play with repeat U and V until we like what we see. Let's try V first. I'm going to set V to 5, and that's already helping. Let's set that up to, I don't know, let's try 20. Getting there. Let's take repeat U and set that to 3. Oh, that might be too much. Let's zoom in on the surface and just see what that's starting to look like. Alright, so if I increase this to 50, what are we getting? You know what? I'm going to switch this over to my high quality renderer. Ah, much cleaner, much easier to see what's going on. So 3 by 50 is giving me some nice lumps and bumps kind of all over the surface. We can try higher. We could try maybe 80 seems a little much. I think 50 was doing okay. 5 seems a little excessive there. So let's just go with 3 by 50 for my repetition. And all that's doing is giving me a lot more detail in the texture. So now as I back away from it, we just see some general noise all over the surface. If you don't change that, it's not like, you don't see the noise at all. You just see like, almost like, it's a little grayer here than it is somewhere else, or a little darker. Can you group layers into folders like in Photoshop? Not that I know of. But that would be kind of fancy. If they've added that, then it's new to me. But, I've been kind of moaning and crying about that for years, and it's never actually been there. All right, so there is the basis for our material. Now we're going to get a little bit fancy. Let's take our noise. And, I have a whole bunch of noises in here because I was doing some experimentation. So if you see this is named Noise 5, don't let that alarm you. But we're going to rename this. Let's go ahead and call this tex for texture, of course. Actually, capital. So tex underscore sparkler underscore light. Just the light version of the texture. All right. And then we're going to duplicate this node, and we're going to duplicate it in a special way. So pay close attention. We're going to go to Edit. So make sure you have this texture, not the node, the Place 2D texture node, just the texture itself. Make sure you have that selected. Go to Edit, go down to Duplicate, and choose With Connections to Network. And notice that what you end up with is a copy of this texture that's still assigned to the original Place 2D texture node. Why is that cool? Well, it means it's going to repeat in the exact same way, which is pretty handy. Go ahead and rename this. This will be tex sparkler underscore dark. Now, obviously, it's a little tricky for us to have both of these nodes plugged in at the same time. We need another node in the interim to handle the transition from the light version to the dark version. We're going to do this by creating a ramp. Here's a ramp. It's over here in your list. So what I want you to do is middle mouse drag a ramp in here, position it just so. Go ahead. Now this is what's going to blow your minds. You do not need a Place 2D texture node for this ramp. We're not going to be using any of its values. So when you're never going to be changing the values, you can delete this node entirely. It becomes irrelevant. I'm going to rename this. We're going to call this tex underscore sparkler underscore ramp. Now, here's where I'm going to start blowing people's minds. Plug this into color. Middle mouse drag, release, and choose color. This is what you should have. You should have tex sparkler light and tex sparkler dark, which we need to change that and make it dark. We'll do that in a minute. And we actually want our ramp to truly be driving their color. That's going to look a little funny at first because your sparkler is just going to be multicolored and in a really weird sort of way that is not particularly useful to us at all. In fact, if we get a close look at it, yeah, that's not going to help us much. Now, we do need to make the dark version of our texture dark. So come over here to text sparkler dark, and all I'm going to do is move both of these sliders down just to make a darker version. I wouldn't go all the way to black, but something like that should work just fine. Now I'm going to do another ready check for people to get up to this point. Yeah. Ryan asked if we can put the sparkler in any layer. Right now I have not put the sparkler in any layer at all. Later on we will create a brand new layer specifically for the sparkler. And we'll just use that to make the sparkler show and hide. Right now we're just building the sparkler, so I personally don't need a layer, so I haven't created one yet. But it looks like we've got most of the group set up and ready to go. So let's go ahead and move on from here. I'm going to select my ramp, and let's get to a point where I can see my sparkler. And just play with these flags and watch what they do. You see, I mean, I've got high quality viewports on, which is why I get instant feedback. If you don't have high quality viewport, if it doesn't work on your computer, I apologize. But I do have it, so I'm kind of using it to my advantage to make a point. But if I squeeze these really, really closely together, without letting them overlap, because if you go too far, you know, they reverse their location. So if I do something like this and don't let them overlap, you see I can have red on the bottom, blue on the top, and a little belt of green in the middle. That's what we want to see. So I'm going to select red, which is currently on the bottom, and watch this. Take Text Sparkler Light. Notice I have the attribute editor open. I'm going to middle mouse drag this texture right on top of selected color. And look what I got. The lighter version of the texture is on the bottom. Now, select the blue flag, take your dark version, middle mouse drag right onto the selected color attribute in the attribute editor, and boom. Now it's easy. Select that little belt of green in the middle, change the color to orange. And there you go. So, I mean, we actually have the effect of a sparkler even right now. We just don't have any way to control it. We could keyframe animate all three of these flags, because these are perfectly animatable. They are driven by the attribute for selected position, which you can see here. And this attribute, like just about any other in Maya, is fully animatable. So we can just animate those flags moving down and thereby create our motion. So again, I'm going to do another ready check for people to kind of get up to this point. And for anybody who needed to see it again, if I step back far enough with undos, I can just show you really all we did is we grabbed the red flag and middle mouse drag our light version right onto the selected color. Grab the blue flag, middle mouse drag the dark version onto selected color, take the color in the middle, make it orange, and that's it. Now you can just push these really, really tightly together, and there you go. So, Insta-Sparkler. Very, very neat trick. The problem now comes with having to set up the animation system, because as an animator, you're not going to want to dig in here and animate each one of these flags individually to make your effect. You want something to smooth it out, to make it easy to do right there in the viewport. You need, what's my word? Who gets the cookie tonight? What do I need for this? A rig! SJC gets it. That's fast response too. Way to go. We need to make a rig for this. Here's where things get fun. Make sure you save your scene. Everybody, hit Control S at this point, and I'm going to close out my Hypershade and just go to File, New Scene. And let me go ahead and show my grid. We are going to create a rig that is utilizing set-driven key. Now, set-driven key is a very, very cool thing in Maya. It's amazingly useful for like a million things. I've used it from character rigs to animating doors and windows, and oh god, I could just go on and on with all sorts of things I've used set-driven key for. Here's what set-driven key is, though. Let's talk about it for just a moment. Set-driven key. Start with a quick review. Animation. Let's talk about it for just a minute. We have a graph. We've seen this before. We've even used this graph inside of Maya to create motion at this point. Have we not? Yes, of course we have, Zach. I'll go ahead and answer myself. Now, in terms of the normal animation that we have been doing, which is keyframe animation, what goes on this side of the graph? What does the vertical axis of the graph represent? Anybody who wants a cookie? A value. Perfect. Attribute value. Attribute value. Now, what does the horizontal or x-axis of the graph represent? You're ahead of it, Wick. It doesn't count. You gotta wait for me to actually ask the question. If you go too early, then, well, it's just premature. So SJC actually gets that cookie, and of course normally this is time. So you can say at time 0 I want my attribute to be here, at time 50 or whatever that would be we want my attribute to be here, and voila, we get animation. It's magical, it's wonderful, it's fantastic, but we don't have to animate this way inside of Maya. We can animate, this is where your mind gets blown, attribute value over other attribute value. Ooh. So how on earth does this work? Well, what this basically means is you could say when one attribute value is low, for instance, which is we'll say attribute value 1 and attribute value 2. We'll keep this as simple as I can. When attribute value 2 is way back here, we want attribute value 1 to be low. When attribute value 2 is way up here, we want attribute value 1 to maybe increase, and Maya will also create animation in between the two. This is perfect for creating things like sliders, like if you actually want to have a separate control for stuff. Now, I want to show you guys how this is done. Do not follow along the first time I do this. Just watch. Please, just watch. All right. I'm going to create, well, there's all kinds of different things I could create. Let's do this. I'm going to go create NURBS primitives and make a sphere. And I'm going to hold down Shift when I create it. That way it's sitting, well, more or less right on top of the grid. It wasn't perfect, though, was it? That's okay. I want it to sit right on top of the grid. And I'm going to go to Create, go to Polygon Primitives, and let's make a cube. And I'll make a little cube, looks something like this. Now let's shade up the scene so you can see what we've got here. Now I'm going to do something kind of fancy, but we've done it before, it's no big deal. This cube, watch closely, I'm going to hold down the D key and move my little marker up, and all that does is that moves the pivot point up to the top, so that now this cube rotates like so. It's like a little doggy door. It is full of stars, isn't it? Okay, so I know I've got at least one sci-fi reader in the room who's made a couple of different random sci-fi references throughout this class that I've caught. That's very cool. So, now what we're going to do is create a set-driven key so that as I take my ball and I drag it forward, this door will automatically open. And it'll automatically close behind it. It's the neatest thing ever. Watch how this works. I'm going to deselect everything. Okay? To create a set-driven key, you will use a special window. You can find this window by going to your animation menu set and going under Animate, Set-Driven Key, Set. So, once again, Animate, Set-Driven Key, Set. And it brings up this window. It has two things, a driver and a driven. The driver is what you will actually be moving. Think of the driver as time. And if you go back to your old animation graph, even when this wasn't two different attributes and was all scary and mind-blowing, even when this was just plain old time, time is the driving force. Time is always just marching forward, and as it marches forward, all of your animation happens in response to it. Well, all we're doing in this case is we're replacing time with another attribute. Now, somebody who's been listening to me very carefully, tell me what should be our driver in this case. What object should be our driver? The ball. MMO Dust wins. So, I'm going to select my sphere and click Load Driver. What Maya does is it loads the object on the left-hand side and gives me a list of all of its animatable attributes on the right. Now, looking carefully at my scene, what attribute is going to do my driving? That's only half the answer. Translate X. Thank you, Wick. Click on Translate X. This will be our driving attribute. Whatever number, whatever value is within the Translate X will be our time in this relationship. Now, obviously that leaves our cube as being the driven, so I'll select it and click Load Driven. Now, to help you guys out, I'll go ahead and hit the rotate tool. So what's my attribute here? It is rotate Z. Very good. You do have to be very careful of this, though, because sometimes, because I'm using world coordinates in my rotate tool, it will be a different axis altogether. The only way to know for sure is to take your rotate tool, this is just a random tip, set it to gimbal mode, and whatever axis you're going to rotate on from there, that's the one you want to animate. That's the only way to be 100% positive. But you're right. In this case, because of the way we created the object, it is rotate Z. Always remember to double check via gimbal, though. So, translate X is going to be driving rotate Z. Now you're just doing keyframe animation. It is the coolest thing. We click key. There's our first keyframe. It's been added. Let's grab our ball. Now remember, our ball, our little sphere here, is like time. Remember when we animated, there was a pattern to animation. You move the time slider first, then you change your attribute value. We have to do the same thing here. You move the driver first, and then you update your driven. So after you've placed your key, you move the driver, and I'm going to move him way through, so all the way to here on the other side. Then grab my driven object and rotate it and hit key again. Now let's test this out, see if this is working. My balls translate X is just like a time slider now. I can drag it forward, I can drag it back. Then if I feel really, really frisky, I can come all the way out to here. Grab rotate Z again. Oh, and watch this. We can just click on rotate Z over here. Well, in the channel box. Oh, well, it doesn't really work anymore. Oh, okay. Double click on the object itself, and that will select it. They change the interface a little bit. So now take rotate Z, set it back to 0, and key one more time. So just to undo, let me undo that so everybody sees it most clearly. So we move forward, go past our original point, go way out here. Then grab our cube, 0 out, rotate Z, and key one more time. And now, what should happen when I move the ball? Anyone? Dun 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 dun. I'm waiting. Nobody knows. The ball. There you go. Door opens, door closes. Very nifty, huh? But it gets even cooler. So all this little window was just a facilitator. It just allowed us to select our attributes and drop in keyframes. And here's the great thing, folks. They're just keyframes. There's nothing special about animating this way. It's just another way to apply plain Jane keyframe animation. It even uses the same node. Your animation curve, and yes, one exists, is stored in the exact same type of node as when you were dropping keyframes to animate your scene. It's just now, instead of feeding off time, it's feeding off another attribute value. I can prove it. Let me get another object in here. I don't even care what to create. Polygon primitive. Let's make a cone, just for something different. And let's get 50 frames. I don't know why. I just feel like having 50 frames. Oh, and I'm still not asking you to follow along yet. I mean, if you are, fine, but I really don't want you to. Hit Shift-W, come up here to frame 50, move forward, hit Shift-W again, and now I've got animation, right? Watch this. With this little animated cone selected, I'm going to go to Window and open up my connections, and let me bring the window over here. It's on my other monitor. Check it out. We have, these are animation curve nodes. You can see if I hold my mouse over. There you go. P-cone, translate 1. These are your nodes that create animation curves. There's a little icon. We have a curve for translate Z, for translate Y, and translate X, all feeding into P-cone 1. Pretty fantastic, right? But take, say, what are we animating for? We're animating on translate X. Don't do that, Windows. If I take translate X and show its input connections, I'll just break that out. Well, Okay, it's not going to automatically show that it's driven by time, which is fine. I mean, the fact that it is automatically driven by time is enough. We know that it is because as we move the time slider, the cone moves. Now watch this. If I select my door, or my little cube here, and go back to Window and open up Connections, and bring my window back over, look at this. Another animation curve node. It's the exact same thing. Driving rotate Z. It's just, it's taking data in from NurbSphere1. Look at the connection. NurbSphere1.translateX is being connected into the input of this animation curve node. The output is being connected into rotate Z. So what's going on inside here? Well, I'll show you. Watch this. If I select my cube and go to Panels, let's go to Save Layouts and open up Persp and Graph. Check it out. Rotate Z has been animated. I can hit the F key. There's my animation curve. But take a look at what Maya is trying to tell me. Maya is trying its best to help. It says pcube1.rotateZ being driven, my driver, is NurbSphere1.translateX. There is some weird little bug though. This label does not stay put. It sort of hovers around and is only in its proper position if 0 is lined up. So as far as I can tell, this pcube1.rotateZ should not be flying around. It's errand code that they have kind of broken. But it is trying to tell you that we're driving one attribute with another. Does this make sense to everyone yet? Yes. All right, well, it looks like most people are saying yes. And it makes some sense. Now, here's where we're going to start all over again, and I want you to do it with me. So, new scene. Don't save. Now you get to work with me. I wanted you guys to see it once, get a real basic gist of the fact that we are just creating animation curves, just like when we were animating. The only thing is those animation curves are going to be driven by another attribute and not by time. Okay. So, here's what we're going to do. Create NURBS primitives or polygon, I don't care, whatever kind of primitive you want, but make a sphere. Set it on top of the grid, drag it off to the side. Go back to create, polygon primitives, make a cube. I would recommend you make a polygon cube and not a NURBS cube. They're easier to work with. Draw out a thin cube, kind of like a door. Hold down D and move the pivot up to the top, like so. Now, just because I want people to follow along with this and understand it, I'll give a ready check at this point. Okay, so we're ready to rock here. Make sure, at least for now, that you deselect everything before continuing. So I have nothing selected. Go to Animate. Again, you have to be in your animation menu set. Press F2 if you're not. Go to Animate, Set Driven Key, Set. Your ball is going to be the object you move, and you want your door to react automatically. Therefore, your ball is the driver. So select your sphere and click Load Driver. Select your door and click Load Driven. Now you need to verify. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to do another ready check. I just want people to get this window open, get the ball loaded in as the driver, get the door loaded in as the driven, and then we'll continue from here. Okay, so now you need to verify your axes. You might have built your scene in a different direction than mine, so do not assume that you're using the same axes that I am. For instance, you might have slid your ball backwards in the Z-axis and that you'll be animating along two entirely different axes. So, verify everything. Select your ball and make sure that the axis that will drive it through the door, make sure you know what that is, because that's the one you want to select. In my case, it's the X-axis. In your case, it could be Z. So choose the proper one. Next, verify the axis around which you will rotate to open the door. You can get your rotate tool out to help, but it's a good idea to hold down the E key and left mouse and set your rotate tool at least temporarily to gimbal mode, because in that way you know exactly which axis you're going to be rotating on. As a matter of fact, you can just rotate the door the way you want it to open and glance over in the channel box. See that rotate Z is updating? Now you know exactly what axis you should be working with. So I'll tap undo and I'll choose rotate Z. Again, because I want everybody to follow along and I want this to make sense, I'm going to do another ready check. Okay, so let's continue. Now, this is just like keyframe animation. We've got to add keys. And just like when we animate, we start with an initial key for our start position. So just click the key button. Notice P cube 1, rotate Z becomes highlighted red. That's exactly the same coloration that you should get when doing regular keyframe animation. Ryan says, I have both of them created, now what? Okay, let me hit undo and close the window. Make sure you take your door and move its pivot point up to the top. Do you have that? Pivot point, the point about which it will rotate. If you do not do this, if I undo, keep undoing, there we go. If I don't do this, see how my door rotates from the center? Does that look like a little doggy door to you? No, it looks like a paddle. In fact, I don't even think our ball can get through that. So, by moving the pivot point up here to the top, the point about which it pivots, then I can rotate around Z, and you see it swings back and forth like a doggy door. Just hold down the D key, and you can move that around wherever you want it to be. So I just slid mine straight up. Now, you need to go to Animate. Please make sure you are under the animation menu set before you try to find Animate. So press F2 if you haven't. Go to Animate, Set Driven Key, and click Set. Your ball is going to be the driver. As you move the ball, the door will respond automatically. So, select your ball and click Load Driver. Select your door and click Load Driven. Now, at this point, you need to verify both of your axes. So select your ball and get the Move tool out. Just use one of the axes of your Move tool and slide the ball through the door, like so. But take a look in your channel box. You see what's updating? Whatever is updating is the axis you want to use. In my case, it's Translate X. In your case, it could be Translate Z. Doesn't matter. So, since I see Translate X updating on the ball, then up here in the driver, I'm going to click on Translate X. Same thing for the door. Get your Rotate tool out. Now, again, as a double check, I like to set my rotation tool over to gimbal mode. You can hold down the E key and left mouse in order to do that. No, the door isn't doing anything yet. We haven't set anything up yet. We're getting there. We've got to actually add the keyframes to make it happen. That was just a question came in from Ryan. He said, but the door isn't doing anything. No, this is a system. That's like saying that I'm moving the time slider, but my characters are not automatically kung fu fighting. We have to animate them kung fu fighting before the time slider will actually do anything. So in this case, we have to animate the door opening before moving the ball does anything at all. So again, all we're doing right now is we're verifying our axes. I want to rotate the door doing this. So I just do this in the viewport and look over in the channel box, and you can see Rotate Z updating. So Rotate Z is my axis for the cube. So I'll just click on Rotate Z. Now is the point where we make the door do anything. We need to create our initial key. So go ahead and click Key. If you select your door, you should see that Rotate Z now has a keyframe on it. That means you're doing it right. Or whichever rotate. You might have had to rotate on Rotate X in your case. That's why we verified our axes. Okay. Now, take your ball, move it just to the other side of the door. Wherever it is, put it on the opposite side, like so. That's just like moving the time slider when you animate, because it is the driver. Therefore, it's just like time. So move the ball to the other side. Now you need to select your door and rotate it open. Before you do anything else, click key. That locks the relationship in place so that now when you move your ball back, the door opens. Now, I'm not even going to add the keyframe for closing the door. I'll let you guys do that if you want to. But that's all we're doing. Each time we click key, we're adding a keyframe between the relationship that exists between translate X and rotate Z on these two objects. And I'll do a quick ready check for people to catch up. Okay, so that's creating a set-driven key. You will establish a relationship between two different objects, being a driver and a driven, with a driving attribute and a driven attribute. And you'll just simply create keyframes between that relationship. And again, it's just like creating keyframes in the following manner, where instead of, in fact, here's another way to look at it that'll be even easier now that we've seen a set-driven key. We have driver and driven. That's all there is to it. And let me tell you, you can do some really fancy stuff with set-driven key once you get in and start playing with those animation curves. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing with this that is going to blow your minds just a little bit. We're going to take a very quick look at Mel. And here's how I want to do it. If you've got your little ball that kind of does all of this waggling and you've got that, you're happy with it, that's all well and good. But just go to File and create a new scene. We're going to do something very, very fancy here, and then we're going to take a break. We are going to create a set-driven key relationship with MelScript. I have a reason for this, but I'm not going to explain my reasoning just yet. Just go with it. So, what I want you to do is create a polygon cylinder. I do not care where it is on the grid. Any location is fine. Give it a little bit of height. So something about like so. I'm not going to do a whole bunch of ready checks for this. If you fall too far behind, you can catch up on the break. Because this is just a demo to help you see generally what it is we're about to do, okay? All right. So once you have your cylinder, go back to Create and make a locator. So we've seen locators. Now I'm going to put my locator, I don't know, just a little bit off the grid. Its exact location is not particularly important. And I'm not going to worry about naming. We're going to keep this all very simple. Okay, now is where we're going to take things slightly to the next level. What I'm going to do is create a set-driven key that will drive a flag on a ramp. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, let me create a ramp. Watch this very, very carefully. We've already seen how to do this, okay? Let's go to Window, Rendering Editors, and open up the Hypershade. We've seen the Hypershade 1 or 2 or 50 times now. Excuse me. Make a brand new Lambert material. Find your ramp. Bring in a ramp. You don't really need the Place 2D texture node, but we're going to ignore that fact for the time being. Connect this ramp over to Color. And then assign this to your cylinder. And in this case, I'm going to press the 6 key and switch over to high quality rendering just so I get real-time feedback. I will give a really quick ready check to get up to this point. So we have our cylinder. Our cylinder has a ramp on it. I want you to double-click on your ramp to open up the attribute editor. Notice that we can take this little green flag on our ramp and we can waggle it up and down. And you see that that actually moves around. Now, you know, by all means, play with your ramp just a little bit so you can get a little blue at the top, a little red at the bottom. And then so you can waggle that green up and down. You can see a response. Pretty cool, right? What we want to do here and this is where it gets kind of fun, is we want to set up a system by which when we move our locator, that green flag also moves up and down. This is harder than it sounds. It's not hard to do, but it's harder than it sounds. So you have to pay very close attention here. Now I'm going to be doing this twice because we have to do it once for this little demo, and then we have to do it again for our sparkler, but I want to make sure everybody gets to see it. So watch this. Select your ramp. Go to Animate, Set Driven Key, Set. Notice here's a little shortcut for you. Whatever you have selected automatically gets loaded into Driven. Here's the problem. We get no attribute in here for the location of this middle flag. Obviously, that's problematic. But you know what? Let's ignore that for just a minute. Let's ignore that. We're going to do a set-driven key that doesn't really do anything special first, just for fact-finding. Because here's the great thing. Anything that you want to know how to do in Maya that you don't know how to do, or if you don't know the underlying, like what Maya's really doing under the hood, Maya will tell you what is actually going on. As long as you can do it somehow in the interface, Maya will tell you what pushing buttons and flipping switches in the interface is doing in Mel underneath the hood in code, which is very, very nifty, and that's what we're going to utilize. So watch this. Grab your driver and click Load Driver, which is our locator in this case. So that's locator 1. Now, here's what I'm going to do. This is just for testing purposes, fact-finding only. We're going to take translate Y, and I'm going to connect this to anything. I don't even care what I connect to. Let's connect it to alpha gain. Why not, right? Because that's fun. But before I hit key, and really, here's your trick, guys. This entire window doesn't really do much in the interface. The only thing that is important is when you click the key button, a very specific mel command is fired, and we need that mel command. How do we get that mel command? Here's how. Right here in the lower right corner of your interface, there is... Oh, okay. Sorry, I just saw it flash and it threw me off. In the lower right corner of the interface, there's this little tiny button that brings up the script editor, which looks kind of like so. This is the script editor. And I'll make it cover up the hypershade right now, which we don't really need at the moment. So I want everybody to open up the script editor. Under command in the script editor, it's not under command, excuse me, it's under history. Under history in the script editor, make sure that echo all commands is on. What this means is that this upper panel will basically tell you everything that happens whenever you click on something in the interface. For example, watch this. If I click on a menu, there's the mel command that fires under the hood to open up the skeleton menu, or edit deformers, and so on and so forth. Every time I do anything, you see the resulting mel command. How cool is that? But there's already a lot of information up here, and it's visually confusing, and it's a pain in the butt. So what we're going to do is right here in your little toolbar, there's clear history. Click on that. And then, isn't this great? It actually feeds back the result of clearing off the history. When it says echo all commands, it bloody well means echo all commands. All right, cool. Now check it out. Locator 1 is set to translate Y. Ramp 1 is set to alpha gain. This means nothing. This is going to be completely pointless for us, but click key anyway. And all of this stuff happens. Generate set driven command. Now, unless you have a little bit of experience with Mel, you won't really know why it's saying all of this stuff. This is called a procedure. It's really just a group of commands that Maya is programmed to recognize. I'll just tell you flat out, you could use both of these if you really want to, but we're not gonna. We don't need this. We want the actual command that was called, which is right here. It's sitting right in front of us. Set driven keyframe, current driver, locator 1.translate Y to ramp 1 alpha gain. The trick is that if you wanted to, you can grab everything that was created here, the whole thing, and if you copy pasted that and ran it as Mel code, it would be just the same as hitting this button. But we are going to grab the specific command. Now, if you wanted to, you could also go line by line and test out each line and figure out which one did the actual work or which ones did the actual work. I'm going to save you that trouble and let you know that it's this one. Set driven keyframe dash current driver locator 1.translate y to ramp 1.alpha gain. All right. Now, I'm going to hit Control C and paste that down here, just so I have access to it. So down here, I should have set-driven keyframe, current driver, locator1.translate y, feeding into ramp1.alpha gain. What does this tell us? Well, we can see our driving attribute. We can see our driven attribute. Very fancy. Now, that's the first part of our fact-finding mission. Close out the set-driven key window. Here's the great thing. We don't really need it anymore. Watch this. This is where it gets even cooler. Go back to your ramp. Once again, clear your history. Make sure you clear the upper pane and not the lower pane, by the way. If you clear the lower pane, you're going to lose this. You're going to have to type it out based on what you see on the screen or go fetch it again. But clear out the upper pane. And do this. Just take your little green flag in your ramp and waggle it once. Check out what you got. Set attribute. It's just a set attribute command, which, by the way, is one of the most common mel commands you can get. It asks for the name of the attribute and the value. There's our important piece of information right there. The name of the attribute. Because remember, over here, our driver was just the name of an attribute. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take ramp1.colorEntryList1.position and hit Control C. And I'm going to paste this over ramp1.alpha gain. Now, if you have no idea what I'm doing, if you're lost, if you're frustrated, if you want to punch your screen right now, you don't have to. All you need to do is exactly this. Type out set driven keyframe. Notice the casing. Casing is very important. Maya is case sensitive, so it's capital D, driven, and then capital K. Dash current driver, the capital D. Now, you need your driving object and your driving attribute. It uses a dot to separate the two. So our driving object is locator 1. Dot, and whatever its attribute is, which in this case is translate Y. Now we need our driven object, which is ramp1. Its attribute is actually a little complicated. It's color entry list, open bracket 1, close bracket, dot position. Because each one of these little color entry lists has got a position and a color, so we need to tell Maya that we're speaking specifically to this flag and we're talking to its selected position. So we say ramp1 dot color, capital E, entry, or make sure I don't misspell stuff, entry, capital L for list, so color entry list, open bracket 1, close bracket, dot position. That's all we have to do right there. When I'm done with that, I can press enter. Look what just happened to selected position. Selected position suddenly turned red. We have created a keyframe on it. Right there with our own little mel command. Now here's where it gets cool. Here, like if it wasn't cool yet, now it's amazing. Take your locator, because remember, it's your driver. Move it up. Take your little flag. Move it up as well. Come back here to your little mel line. Tap the up arrow key, because it's just like clicking the key button again, and press enter. Now watch what happens. How awesome is that? I have a locator which is actually updating a part of my texture. Now, why did I have to go through mel? Because there's no way to bring this information, this little flag, his position doesn't automatically show up in the window. So we had to take the long way around. Now, because I know that was probably confusing to 92% of you, I'm actually going to do the whole thing one more time. Just watch closely, okay? File, new scene. Don't save. we need to create our cylinder, something to hold our material. So I'm going to create a polygon cylinder, like so. Go ahead and shade things up. Create our locator. Yeah, actually, I'm hoping that there's a pretty good percentage of you that does get this, but I realize it can be a mind job if you haven't seen this stuff before, or if you're not used to coding in any form or fashion. So I'm trying to take it really easy on everybody. All right, so back to creating our material. And we all know how to make materials at this point. So window, rendering editors, go to the hypershade. That's awesome. We don't need our default rendered layer. That's great. So create a Lambert material, like so, and go ahead and assign it. Grab a ramp, bring in a ramp. Get this out of the way. You just go away, won't you? All right, and then middle mouse drag and connect this to color. Over here in the viewport, I'll hit 6 so we can see that. I'll also make a few edits to my ramp so it's red on top. I'm sorry, red on the bottom, blue on top, and green in the middle. And I'm going to pull my green flag way down low. So we'll start with something like that. Now, all of this I'm considering being pretty straightforward, and none of you should really have a problem getting this far. We need 2 pieces of information. We need to know how to talk to Maya through Mel to make a set-driven key. We also need to know what happens in Maya when we take this flag and waggle it up and down. To get these pieces of information, we need to open up the script editor and make sure we grab history and turn on echo all commands. That means Maya is going to tell us everything that happens in the interface. It's frustrating sometimes. Sometimes it gives you, actually most of the time, it gives you more information than you need, and you got to pick and sort through everything. So, open up your set-driven key window. Animate, set-driven key, set, and here you go. Let's set up our driver and our driven, and I'll get some stuff out of the way for just a moment. Our driven object, the object we want to affect, is the ramp, which coincidentally is already here, but if it wasn't, just select your ramp node and click Load Driven. Select your locator and click Load Driver. As we move the locator, we want the ramp to change. It's a very simple relationship. Translate Y. Up and down motion on the locator is what's going to be our driving attribute. That's easy. We have no idea what our driven attribute will need to be to wiggle our little central flag up and down, but that's okay. Right now, we don't need to know that. We just want to know what goes on when we create it, when we click the key button. Basically, how do we create a set-driven key in code? So attach this to anything. It doesn't matter. I'll bring the script editor back in, and I'll clear out the history so I have a nice blank slate to work from. Then click key, and there's our command. Set-driven keyframe dash current driver, then the driving object dot driving attribute, driven object dot driven attribute. Grab that command, copy paste it into the lower window. You're just saving it for later. Or if you want to be super careful so you don't lose it, paste it over into Notepad or something so you don't lose it or accidentally delete it. That's also a good thing to keep in mind. Now you need to know what Maya is thinking or what happens under the hood when you change this ramp around. So just select your ramp, navigate to it in any one of 100 different ways, clear out your history once again, and move that flag. And there's your command. Set attribute ramp1 dot color entry list, open bracket, 1, close bracket, dot position. There is our driver and its attribute right there. Copy that, paste over ramp1.alphaGain. There's your whole command. You didn't even have to type it if you didn't want to. You can make it. You can make Maya tell you the command. You can actually take this whole command and hit Control-C, get out of the script editor entirely at this point, get out of the set-driven key window, and get out of the hypershade. Because now, you can put your little flag where you want it to be at the beginning, paste in your command, and press enter, and look, selected position suddenly got keyframed. Move your driver up. Go back to your ramp. Move your driven. Come back to Mel, tap the up arrow key, and press enter. And there's your second keyframe. And you have feedback. If you use the high quality renderer, if you've got it, you'll see instantaneous feedback. And there you go. So I've carried on now for 109 minutes on video. We're an hour and a half into the class, which means we're going to have to speed up a little bit on the back end. But now's the time we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. I want everybody who is following along to give this a shot. If you are just kind of watching, that's okay. We're going to use this, and you can already see how if you think about it. We're going to use this to make our sparkler, the little body that we've created. We're going to animate that transition between what's burned and what isn't using this method. So that will wrap up this first part of the video. Let's everybody who can take a 10-minute break. If you need to give this a try, go ahead and do that. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them.